Has us going through the Gospel of Luke, and for this particular Sunday we have the story and the passage of Jesus as a child, age 12 or so, at the temple. It's a passage that many of us are familiar with, and knowing that Jesus was part of the Jewish faith, this is probably a good comparison to his bar mitzvah. At around that age, he should be questioning his faith and talking to rabbis and asking questions. You find the story in this passage in the Pew Bibles. Page 45 of our Pew Bibles if you want to follow along. It is not in Matthew or Mark or John. It's only in Luke. For some reason, Luke found it important to go ahead and talk about Jesus as a child and the relationship that he had with his parents. I want you to notice how patient Mary is portrayed in this passage. She definitely was not a Cuban mother that could take off her flip-flopper sandal and reprimand her boy that way, the way that I was. According to Luke, every year, Jesus and his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up as usual for the festival. And when the festival was ended, and they started to return, the boy Jesus had stayed behind in Jerusalem. But his parents did not know it. Assuming that he was in the group of travelers, they continued on the day's journey. And they started to look for him among their relatives and friends. And when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." And he said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he said to them. And then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient. And his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divinity and human favor. Here ends this reading, and we ask for God's blessings upon it. In getting ready for this sermon, I was also thinking of the gospel writer John, who is also attributed several epistles. And in his first letter, chapter 4, John wrote, "God is love. When we live in love, we live in God, and God in us. In this way, love is made complete among us so that we will have confidence on our final day, because there is no fear in love." Would you please pray with me? May the words from my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. Grace and peace be with you on this day. Ever heard someone say, "Don't tell me what to do"? It's very common with children and teenagers, right? But it's also a trait of most adults. Most people just don't like being told what to do, even if it's for their own good. Not too long ago, I was in a waiting room full of people, and I witnessed a young father patiently deal with a temper tantrum of his toddler. It was obvious to everyone that the child needed to take a nap. And the young father kept on saying to the child, "You need to sleep. Just lay your head down and sleep." And the toddler would protest, "No, stop telling me to sleep. I don't want to sleep." And then the father asked the toddler, "So what's wrong? Why are you crying?" And the toddler said to everyone's amusement, "I don't know." We all laughed, as it's amusing to see a child speak in that way, and it just made the poor child get angrier as he saw that everyone was laughing at him, and he began to cry even louder. Sometimes, I hate to say this, but it's the truth, we are like that toddler. It's obvious to others what we need, but for some reason, we don't see it. We are blind to what everyone else sees, and sometimes we're even deaf. We don't want to hear it. People are telling us exactly what we need to do, and still we continue forward with our own view of what's happening. And so we whine and we complain, and sometimes we do something even worse. We might even sabotage our own well-being. There are times when grown adults stuck in a toddler phase of blindness approach me as a pastor. They think that maybe I could say exactly what they want to hear. And I listen to them, and I ask them, "So, what do you think we should do?" And they stand there in silence, and it's a question they didn't expect, because maybe they thought I would tell them exactly what was wrong. But that's not my role. My role is not to tell people the answer. At least that's how I see my role. And that sometimes makes them upset, because they want to be told what to do. But in my opinion, and in my experience, because there have been times where I've told people what to do, they don't like it. I learned that one in my first year of marriage. Often it's better just to ask the question and to figure it out together, and then together to take those steps. And even though it might be very clear as to what it is that it should be done, to get everybody in on it and for them to kind of like figure it out. The role of the church is best accomplished when the church serves as a guide. If we start telling people what to do, most of them will get upset because they don't want to be told what to do. Even if they can't verbalize themselves what the problem is, most people just have this aversion to being told how to live their lives and how it is that they should be doing on their day-to-day. It's a problem of the church. It has been continual for many, many, many generations. Just because the Ten Commandments are in the Bible, we think that somehow or another that gives us a license to tell people what to do. A couple of years ago, I had an honest conversation with a relatively young man in his 40s. I know that Chuck Grimm would call him a babe. And this conversation was about the role of the church in today's polarized and divided society. And the young man had strong negative opinions on church and on my vocation as a pastor. And somehow he decided that I was strong enough to hear his opinions without taking offense. And I tried to live up to that expectation. I really did. As I listened and offered counterpoints in what I thought was calm, cool, and collected. It turns out that I may not have been so calm, cool, and collected, because 20 minutes into the conversation, my beloved wife had to come to my rescue and tell me that I was needed somewhere else. I'd like to tell you about this conversation, but in a nutshell, the young man argued that most pastors and churches, if not all, by the way he sounded, are only interested in keeping people happy. He called them feel-good churches full of feel-good sermons that don't address what is truly wrong with society. He then went in for the kill by saying that pastors, and he pointed the finger at me, tend to privilege happy stories over unhappy ones, which ultimately present a false view of the world. Fighting the urge to push back, I asked him, "So what do you think is wrong with society?" And the young man just rambled on until I cut him off with a question that was straighter to the point. And I said, "Well, would you say that we, the American people, have lost hope?" He digressed and avoided answering the question, so I had to ask him again. And this time he answered in the positive. Yes, we have lost hope. And that's when I jumped in and passionately argued for the societal need of church. Because it is here, in church, where we find and offer hope to people who are hungry for it. And yes, I told him our sermons have a way of feeling good, because ultimately, hope feels good. And I spoke about the focus of the church. The focus is love. And as we follow the commandment of Jesus to love our neighbor, love also feels good. And it was at that time that I was ushered away. It turns out that my arguing points were very vociferous, not very loving of me as I'm talking about love. So this conversation has stayed with me over the years, and the question I keep pondering is, how representative is this young man of the community at large? How many people feel and think the way he does, even if most people can't verbalize it with the ease that he did? I don't know that I'll ever get the answer to that question, but it's one that I ponder. Now, I know that many of us, if not all, are seeing the growing unease and dis-ease in our society, the deep cauldron of disappointment that is festering. And a human response to this malady is to avoid it. Many of us have stopped watching the news or commentary shows that harp on what they think is the problem. And we avoid it because it heightens our feelings of frustration and anger. And those who don't avoid the commentators are being led to join in the finger-pointing and in the blame game. Over the history of our nation, different groups have been targeted as the cause for the problems in our nation. At one point, it was the Irish and the Italians. In the 1950s, it was the communists, and Senator Joseph McCarthy embarked in persecution that destroyed many good lives. In the late 60s, the military and the government were catching the blame as people burned their draft cards and spoke derisively of most institutions. At the start of this decade, we witnessed Occupy Wall Street, a movement that blamed the billionaire investment firms on Wall Street for all the problems we were having. Shouting back with an equal amount of contempt were people pointing the fingers at Barack Obama and the liberals. In 2017, we saw thousands of young men marching down the streets of Charlottesville chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And more recently, we're hearing that the fault of everything in our nation is attributed to President Trump and the Republicans. The fact is that each finger-pointing group can find several nuggets of truth to make their argument seem justified, which only leads to the broader realization that we all share in the blame and that we all better own up to our behavior and contributions to the problems we're experiencing in our nation. When I've shared this viewpoint with others, especially those who think that only one particular group is to blame, I've been told that our society has grown cynical and that no leader, whether it be in the public or the private sector, is going to share in the blame. And they say that personal accountability is asking way too much in today's age. And I respond, is it? Have we become the proverbial toddler that is crying with exhaustion and unable to verbalize what's wrong? It sure is beginning to look that way. As a pastor, I'm going to go down the spiritual route because I strongly believe in the soul. And I've been pondering about the condition of our collective soul, the soul of our nation. Could there be a collective soul of humanity in this culture of cynicism that is crying out for a loving God, but we're just unable to articulate it? Can we imagine God, our loving parent, asking us, "What's wrong? Why are you feeling this way?" And we just turn away and continue to disbelieve or continue to complain. To live with sincerity in a culture of cynicism is a difficult dance, one that comes easily only to the very young and to the very old. The rest of us in between struggle with the societal forces that seek to compete for our sense of hope. And in the end, many of us are left in a state of disbelief. Author and modern-day philosopher Maria Popova clarified the definition of cynicism. Critical thinking without hope is cynicism. Hope without critical thinking is naivete. In order for us to survive this era that we're in, both as individuals and as a society, and in order for us to thrive, we need the right balance of critical thinking and of hope. I'm reminded of William Sloane Coffin Jr., who memorably asserted, "Pastors and churches do not interpret our lives. They shape our lives by inserting hope into it." Which is why during this Christmas season, year after year, we retell the same story, because it has been said to be the greatest story that there ever was. It's the story of a teenage girl giving birth to a child who would bring down an empire and change the world just by teaching and promoting love. Read the story, pick up the Bible, and go through the Gospels, and you will not see that it is infected with cynicism. Read the stories, and you will see love reaching out, trying to heal and mend and offer hope. And so I'm going to go now with a feel-good story, one that the young man would have been critical of, but one that I think is very important for us to know. Have you heard of the White Envelope Project? Anybody here heard of the White Envelope Project? You can Google it. You can look it up. It's a thing. It's happening. It began in the early 1980s when a woman married a man who hated Christmas. Imagine that. Somebody who hates Christmas. You start getting a picture in your mind of this person being a curmudgeon, being, somebody who's grumpy all the time, but that's not the case. The guy had a lot of virtues. There was a lot of good things about him, but somehow or another, he hated Christmas. And the man said it was nothing but one big commercial nonsense. Now, once they were married and they were having children, he agreed not to ruin Christmas for the children. But over the years, he just couldn't help himself. He would rant and rave about the state of the world, the nonsense the church pastors preached, and the ridiculous Black Friday sales, and about how people were their very worst during this holiday season. Now, this husband loved children, and so he was a teacher and a coach. And he coached, out of all things, wrestling. And at one wrestling meet, his team clobbered the opposing team. That opposing team was from the inner city. And it was very obvious that they did not have the resources that his school and his team had. Their uniforms were very poor. Their shoes weren't the right shoes. And not one of them had any headgear. Headgear is that protective device that is to protect them from any head injuries. And then after the husband's team won by such a huge margin, he looked at the other team and he felt bad for them. He knew that such a devastating loss could be very demoralizing, that no child deserves that. His wife was moved by his virtuous sentiment, so she decided to do something. And she enlisted the help of a local sports equipment store to provide headgear and new uniforms and other assorted equipment to that inner city team. And the gift was sent anonymously to them, and she heard through the store manager that those children were ecstatic when they learned of the donation. That Christmas, the wife placed a letter inside a blank white envelope, and that white envelope, she placed it on the tree, describing exactly what she did. And after all the gifts were unwrapped, and after all the children had their toys, they turned to the white envelope and they opened it and they saw the letter, and one of the children read it. And when the husband learned what his wife did, his smile was beyond what she ever imagined. She describes it as lasting more than a week. He was so moved by her generosity. The next Christmas, another white envelope was on the Christmas tree, describing another good deed that the wife had done. And so a tradition was born by the third Christmas. And then eventually every member in that family started to place their own white envelope on the tree, describing a good deed that they had done for a worthy cause or for a person. And that is how the husband learned the meaning of Christmas. And that is how he got to love Christmas. And he put aside his cynicism. He put aside every argument that he had as to why the season was not good. He learned that Christmas is not about complaining. It's not about ranting and raving about what is wrong with the world, but rather it's about contributing some small act of kindness that in some small way will help repair the world. My friends, this Christmas season, let us find our own reason to have a white envelope in next year's tree. Let us find an act of charity, of goodness, an act that will help somebody else, anonymously or maybe not, to help give the season a personal meaning beyond what the stores and the commercial industry has pushed. This Christmas season, let us also stop the childishness, the finger pointing, and the blame game. Instead, let us be part of the solution. Let us help mend our nation and the world, and by doing so, we just might be surprised. We might be mending our own soul. This Christmas season, by golly, let us love. Let us love each other. Let us love ourselves. Let us turn to each other in love, regardless of that which might keep us apart, regardless of that which we might be in contradiction of. In this age of cynicism, love is the answer. Love is the cure, and it is the antidote. It is the meaning of Christmas. Amen. So now I call the ushers forward to receive the morning offering. We ask you to give generously and to give cheerfully so that others might receive. This year, add a bit of love to that gift, to that offering that you put on the plate. So that love can go with your offering to a world that is in deep need of it. Ushers, please come forward.